The story starts with the narrator walking into a photographer's studio and saying, "I want my photograph taken." The photographer, who is a rather dull and lifeless man dressed in a grey suit, looks at him without any interest. He has the eyes of a scientist who studies things coldly, without emotion. The narrator quickly tells the readers that there is no need to describe the photographer further because everyone knows what a typical photographer looks like. The photographer instructs the narrator to sit and wait. The narrator waits patiently for a long time, about an hour. While waiting, he picks up old magazines to pass the time, including Ladies' Companion from the year 1912, Girls' Magazine from 1902, and Infant's Journal from 1888. These outdated magazines show how long the narrator had to wait. During this time, the narrator starts to feel like he has made a mistake by coming to the studio and troubling the photographer with his appearance. He feels like he has intruded on the photographer's scientific work with his face. After a long wait, the photographer opens the door to his studio and, in a stern voice, calls the narrator in. The narrator enters the studio and the photographer tells him to sit down. The narrator sits on a stool in a beam of sunlight. The sunlight is not natural but is filtered through a sheet of cheap cotton hanging over a frosted skylight. This setup makes the room look less professional, and it is clear that the studio is not fancy. The photographer brings a large machine to the center of the room and then crawls into it from behind. He spends only a few seconds inside the machine, quickly taking a look at the narrator before coming out again. He starts fussing with the cotton sheet and the window panes using a hooked stick. The narrator humorously suggests that the photographer is in a panic, trying to get more light and air. After some adjustments, the photographer crawls back into the machine and covers himself with a black cloth. He remains quiet this time, and the narrator guesses that the photographer is praying for the picture to come out well. The narrator stays quiet out of respect, not wanting to disturb the photographer. When the photographer finally emerges, he looks very serious and shakes his head. He declares, "The face is quite wrong." The narrator calmly agrees with him, saying that he has always known his face was wrong. This light-hearted comment reveals the narrator's self-deprecating humor. The photographer suggests that the narrator's face would look better if it were turned 3/4 full. The narrator eagerly agrees, saying that many faces look better from a 3/4 view because it makes them appear wider and larger. He even jokes that the photographer's face would also look better from that angle. However, the photographer is no longer listening to him. At this point, the photographer steps closer to the narrator, takes the narrator's head in his hands, and starts to twist it sideways. The narrator humorously thinks the photographer is about to kiss him and closes his eyes, but he quickly realizes that he was mistaken. The photographer is just adjusting his face to get a better angle. After twisting the narrator's head as far as it will go, the photographer stands back and looks at it again. He sighs once more and comments, "I don't like the head." The photographer then goes back to the camera and takes another look. He asks the narrator to open his mouth slightly, but before the narrator can do so, the photographer changes his mind and tells him to close it. Then, after taking another look, the photographer comments that the narrator's ears look bad and asks him to make them droop a little more. The narrator obliges. The photographer continues giving more absurd instructions, such as rolling the eyes under the eyelids, placing the hands on the knees, and turning the face slightly upwards. He asks the narrator to expand his lungs, hunch his neck, contract his waist, and twist his hip towards his elbow. Despite all these strange adjustments, the photographer still does not like the face. He remarks that it is too full. At this point, the narrator has had enough. He stops the photographer speaking with emotion but maintaining his dignity. He explains that this face is his face, not the photographer's. He has lived with it for 40 years and knows its flaws. The narrator admits that his face may not be perfect, and he wasn't meant to have it, but it is the only face he has. He says that despite its imperfections, he has learned to love it. This speech shows the narrator's frustration, but also his acceptance of himself. He tells the photographer that his mouth, ears, and everything else about his face belong to him. And if the photographer's machine is too narrow to capture it properly, then that's the machine's fault. Just as the narrator begins to rise from the seat, the photographer pulls a string and snaps the picture. The narrator hears a sharp snick sound, and he realizes that the photograph has already been taken. He sees the machine shaking slightly from the shock of capturing his image. The photographer, now with a pleased smile, says that he believes he caught the narrator's features at just the right moment. In a moment of animation, the narrator sarcastically responds, saying that he didn't think he could animate his features, but he asks to see the picture. However, the photographer informs him that there is nothing to see yet, because the negative must first be developed. The narrator is told to come back on Saturday to see a proof of the photograph. On Saturday, the narrator returns to the studio. The photographer beckons him in with a quiet and grave manner, showing more pride than before. The photographer unfolds a large proof of the photograph, and both the narrator and the photographer look at it in silence. The narrator, after a moment, asks, "Is it me?" The photographer replies, "Yes, it is you," and they continue staring at the image. The narrator points out that the eyes in the picture do not look much like his own. The photographer explains that he has retouched the eyes and proudly says that they came out splendidly. The narrator agrees that they look fine, but wonders about the eyebrows, which don't seem to match his real ones. The photographer, glancing at the narrator's face, explains that he has removed the eyebrows because there is now a process called Delphide that allows new eyebrows to be added. The photographer says he doesn't like hair growing low on the skull, so he has altered it to create a new brow line. The narrator, now growing more frustrated, asks about the mouth. The photographer replies that the mouth has been adjusted because the narrator's real mouth was too low, and he couldn't use it in the photograph. The narrator sarcastically notes that the ears in the picture look like his, thinking they are the only part that remains unchanged. The photographer acknowledges that the ears do resemble the narrator's, but adds that they can be fixed too. There is a new process called sulfide that can remove the ears entirely if needed. At this point, the narrator can no longer hide his frustration. He stands up straight, makes his face as expressive as possible, and speaks with scorn towards the photographer. He tells the photographer that he came to the studio for a photograph of himself, a picture that would look like him. He wanted a photograph that could capture his face as it was given to him by nature, even if it was not perfect. The narrator expresses his desire for a photograph that his friends could keep to remember him after his death. He feels that the photographer has destroyed this possibility by altering his face so much. The narrator sarcastically tells the photographer to continue with his brutal work of fixing the photograph. He tells him to dip the negative in various chemicals, sulfide, bromide, oxide, and even cowhide, if he wants. The narrator mockingly suggests that the photographer should remove the eyes, correct the mouth, adjust the face, and even restore the lips, reanimate the necktie, and reconstruct the waistcoat if needed. He tells the photographer to coat the photograph in gloss, shade it, and emboss it until even the photographer thinks it is finished. Finally, the narrator tells the photographer to keep the photograph for himself and his friends, as it holds no value to him anymore. He declares it to be a worthless bauble and then bursts into tears, leaving the studio.